We've had a lot of people in particular ask questions about Marguerite's process when she develops her sculptural works. She does a number of different techniques in order to deploy these forms using slip casting and different mold making techniques, as well as colored clay and different glazes. And so she's going to give us a little bit of insight into her process today with a nice kind of informal studio talk for us. And so we encourage you to pose your questions in the chat. We'll also save a little bit of time at the end for a Q&A session. And I'm sure if Marguerite sees a really poignant question in the chat, then she can sort of answer some of them as she goes along, although she will be showing us her mold, so she'll be kind of juggling that. So I'll also be helping moderate the chat and our Q&A session for Marguerite. Marguerite is a full professor of art at Washburn University, whose work explores the spaces of art, science, healthcare, and personal experiences. By examining subjects through arts-based research, she explores the intersection of art, science, and personal experience to create interactive installations featuring her porcelain work. Of course, for more information on Marguerite's work, our other lead exhibition artists, Bruce Schurting and Robin Lasser, as well as the overall show, The State We're in Water, you can visit our website, www.okstates.edu, or any of our social media channels. And of course, the recording of this video will be on our YouTube channel, as well as all of the upcoming talks, which are part of the Voices from the Hydrosphere lecture series. And so I can't end this introduction without plugging Marguerite's next talk, in which she will be partnering with our other exhibition artist, Robin Lasser, to talk specifically about The State We're in Water and give us a holistic tour of the installation. So without further ado, I am going to start share screening, and I will turn over the floor to Marguerite.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight and visiting me in my studio. I'm very lucky to be able to work in my living space. I would say that if you work in clay, you need to separate your working space from your living space. And this actually works out great because I have a walkout basement. And so the whole basement, the whole walkout basement, which is filled with light, and it's a very, it was a family room before I moved in here. Now it's like totally like been destroyed, but now you know, it's all studio, so it's worked out really well for me. I'm going to talk a little bit about my piece in the transmutation piece that's in the exhibition, and how I manipulate form in that installation. And I'm going to give you just kind of an overview about mold making because I was asked to do that. If you have any questions about anything, again, I'm right in my studio. I can pull things, I can show you things. So let me know. The transformation, the transmutations, it's an idea of starting with pieces that have been cast, but like manipulating them a lot. So I really see that as a starting point and not an end point. So maybe we can go to the next slide. So these are just some images from the installation, some of the works that are in the installation. And you can see that's, you know, so these three pieces that are diagonal, these, it's a children's life vest for swimming and boating. And they are very, very different pieces, but they're all from the same mold. And so that's kind of how I work. I don't try to create something that's perfect. That's not part of my interest area. We can go to the next slide. And I'm really interested in combining objects and telling a story through them. A friend of mine told me I create these ecosystems, and they're ecosystems around different environmental issues. This particular table is about swimming in plastics and how plastics have infiltrated all of our waterways. And people are very familiar now with the fact that there is a lot of plastic in the ocean, but most of the plastic in the ocean comes from our interior waterways. So even though that's not as studied, and people are becoming much more interested in actually analyzing that now. That we really are dealing with that issue in our waterways here in the center of the country. I live in Lawrence, Kansas, which is directly north of Stillwater by about 4 hours. So I'm basically in the same kind of system that you are in Stillwater. And all of that is running down into the ocean. And so all the plastics that end up in those waterways are what are actually causing the problem in the ocean. And we can go on to the next slide.
Hold on one. Sorry, give me 1 second here.
No worries.
There we go.
Okay, cool. So, what you just saw was like a pink ring, and then here's a white ring. Again, that's the same mold. And then I beat it up, and I kind of add a lot of things to it, and I push and pull different areas of it in order to create a unique piece each time. It's a combination of slip trailing and burnout, ceramic burnout, and press molding and adding on. Have been press molded as well as slip cast. And slip again is liquid clay, and press molding is when you take clay that you're more used to seeing that's more pliable as a semi-solid and pushing it into a mold and then taking it out. In this particular image, there is a kind of worked out shoe above the white ring. That's something I picked up. I think it was McMurtry Lake McMurtry. I picked up when I was in Oklahoma about summer of 2019. I picked up lots of objects that were lakeside, and we visited a lot of different lakes. And I think that the piece that's in that particular setting with the white ring, that's on the right, on the bottom, that was like a child's little sand shovel that also had been abandoned and was sitting lakeside. And so I think that was Caw Lake. I think that one was Caw Lake. So then I took these home and I cast them, and I put them into some context. On the right side is kind of more of a view looking into the space and some various objects. Just kind of pointing out that there's something that looks like a grenade, but that's not a real grenade. That's something I got at Walmart that had water balloons in it. So it just kind of blew my mind a little bit that you would put water balloon kind of fun toy for children in something that looked like a grenade kind of container. So I cast that, of course. So so just kind of lots of different approaches there and different objects. I usually start with a cast of something that exists in the world that I found, either that drew my attention in the consumerist world of purchasing things at Walmart or those kind of venues, or physically out of the environment that's been part of the waste stream. We can go to the next slide. So this is just kind of an explanation of the different approaches I use. So I use press molding, which I'll explain. I can show you a bunch of press molds in a little bit that I use to make different textures and different pieces that get attached. Slip casting is when you take liquid clay and you have a plaster mold, and the plaster mold sucks the moisture out of the liquid and leaves a solid behind, and then you can use that piece. It's in the form of the mold. Thixotropy is a really interesting characteristic of slip. Plaster does this also. It means that when something seems, it's a characteristic of certain materials where they seem like they're solid, but if you shake them a little bit, they become pliable again, they become more liquefied again. So a lot of the times I will really bend a shape by letting it sit in the mold, but before it totally sets, before it becomes hardened, I will shake it up a little bit and I'll be able to twist it into different shapes that way. And it won't crack and it won't break because it becomes semi-liquefied again. So that is a really, I was really fascinated by that and I use that a lot. Slip trailing is when you put clay into some kind of container. Maybe it's something like a little squeeze bottle. Yeah, so yeah, this is where you have to like go back into something else. This is actually a really nice little squeeze bottle that I got from a hair dye thing. Not that anyone in my family dyes their hair, but it has like a screw top that you can keep, that you can take on and off. And so you can put slip in here and you can create lines, you can build them up and create patterns with this. You can create different textures with it. It's also possible to buy a whole system, and you know, this is really nice. It's not very expensive, and you have different nibs on this, and so you can have different line qualities. So slip casting, I use that quite a bit to create some of my textures. For instance, like this piece, which has not been, I'll try to get it closer. This piece, which has not been fired yet, it'll get tighter when it gets fired. And a lot of that is slip casting that's in there, in that texture. So slip casting is something I use. We can go back to the slide now. I also embed shards and remnants of broken porcelain that had been fired to bisque or to clay or to maturity. Even glazed pieces I can embed. And I do this a lot. When I'm not satisfied with something, I break it up, but I don't throw it away because a lot of the time that'll end up being in a new piece. Mixing colored slips. I do a lot of mason stain. I guess I got to show more stuff again. So mason stain is a pigment. It's actually called mason stain, M-A-S-O-N, and there's a whole range of colors. And it's a dry pigment that you can mix into a clay, and you can mix it into slip. Sometimes I mix it into slip, and then I put the slip on a plaster, a piece of big cast plaster. I have several squares of plaster that I use to dry out slip so that I can make a clay body that is colored that I can put in press mold. But I also use the colored slip too to cast with. The only problem with this is you have to be really careful because anything that's powdered is very dangerous. So you have to wear a mask. We're all used to that now, but you have to wear a mask. For instance, this Florentine green color, which will be like a nice kind of greenish, bluish color when I fire it. It has cobalt in it. Cobalt is a really dangerous heavy metal if you absorb that. So you have to be really careful of these, but it gives you an opportunity to do things beyond just having white clay. It gives you a different quality than if you were, these are just some of the shards of things that I've broken up, but it gives you a different quality than glazing. And I'm always interested in trying to create a surface that feels like it's integrated and not sitting on the top. So that's another thing that I use a lot. I don't think I need to show anything else. And then I also am really big on experimentation. So I'm an installation artist who started out as a photographer and then started incorporating three-dimensional objects sculpturally. I went to graduate school. I just have tried everything. I went to graduate school for painting, but then I started painting three-dimensional objects and making sculptural installations. And then, so I never actually, well, I took one class that I guess was sort of ceramics one, but I never actually took a ceramics class. So I kind of respond to what can I do for this installation that I'm interested in creating. And so if I'm making an installation about objects that are part of the waste stream, it just appealed to me that it had to be cast in porcelain, because there's a certain kind of reputation of porcelain being something that is very durable, but also that it's something that people treasure. And you have your porcelain dishes. I don't, but like when you get married, I didn't get porcelain dishes when I got married, but anyway, it's got this kind of reputation as being precious. And I was working with the waste stream, so I felt like it had to be porcelain. So I had to start working with porcelain. So for me, it's all about experimentation. And a friend of mine who is a fiber artist talks a lot about embracing the gift of the process. And the gift of the process is this idea that you have expectations, but if something happens, that's okay, because you can learn from that, or maybe it makes it better. And that is certainly my philosophy. So I've really taken that to heart. Also in my work, I use a lot of ceramic decals. It's pigments that are on sheets that you can apply to your ceramics, and then it burns in when you do your firing. I also combine all of my work with photography and other graphics, and all of that builds into an installation. So I'm ready for the next slide. And so just really quickly, this is like kind of the things that I think about. I believe it's really important to consider what your interests are. So for me, I don't want perfect forms, because I'm thinking about decay and the drama of change and reordering of the material world. I'm really interested in how everything is continuously repurposed and transformed. And I really love the philosophy of wabi-sabi, which is a part of Japanese aesthetics, where it's a worldview that kind of focuses on the transience of imperfection, of things in the material world, and honoring them. And a lot of people ask me if it's about entropy, which is this idea about order in nature and how everything is actually, moving at once towards greater organization, and then also falling apart and moving towards disorder at the same time. And I guess I do incorporate all those things, but I think the first two are more like where I'm going with that. I have a colleague whose work is about machinery and the machine world and perfection, and his work is absolutely gorgeous. So for him, his mold making, I'm just setting you expectations about my mold making. So his mold making is immaculate, and you can create the most beautiful molds. But for me, I don't care about that, because my philosophy and my intention is completely different. So I think it's important to know what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. Okay, I'm ready for the next slide. Okay, so anyway, this is basically what you've been seeing behind me, my studio. I keep all my molds because I never know how I'm going to reuse them. And then a couple of pieces that haven't been fired yet behind me. Next slide. They're everywhere in nature. So if you have a fossil, you have a mold. And I actually proved this in the part on the right-hand corner, because that's a fossil of I don't know, all the middle of the country used to be covered by an ocean. So that's a fossil of some oyster-like creature, and you press clay in it and you get an impression from that. So that exists in nature completely. Next slide. So here's a press mold that I made. I made it out of zebra mussels. Zebra mussels are an invasive species that originate in the Mediterranean and in Eastern Europe. And they're all over all of our lakes now. And they're a problem in that they change the, they change the relationship, they change the nature of the ecology of the lakes. And so it's very controversial because actually a lot of the lakes in the Midwest aren't even supposed to be there. They're all dammed lakes, so people say, well, what difference does it make? But anyway, so those are zebra mussel shells. So and then this piece here next to it is a piece of limestone where they were anchoring themselves, and you can see the impressions of where they were anchoring themselves. So that is creating kind of a fossil and kind of a mold. But I also glued the mold down, and I made my own press mold from the zebra mussels. And then the next slide. So that's a 1-part mold. So then I press clay into that, and I pull it out. And then I can use this as a surface on top of a tile, a cast object. So I do this a lot where I'm creating textures from a 1-part mold, but applying it to other purposes. So that's a really easy way to make a mold. So for today, I was thinking about what am I going to make a mold out of? So I have all these little objects. These are little sculptures of dinoflagellates, which are little creatures that cause the red tides, but they also cause the phosphorescence in oceans that happen sometimes in the year, and they're benign when that. So they're really interesting little creatures, and there's a lot of variety in form. And I actually started to make these particular objects a few years ago for a completely different purpose, and I abandoned it because it wasn't going to work for what I was going to do. And if you go to the next slide. So I did make a series at some point where I covered all these with paint and decals, and I made these with epoxy clay. And so they're too heavy to use. I was thinking of making something that was floating, but they were too heavy to use for that purpose. So this class gave me the opportunity to think about making molds of these. And then they can be porcelain. I can apply different textures to them. They'll be hollow and they'll be light. So that's what I decided to make a mold of for this class. So if you go to the next slide. So the first thing I did is identify one that I was going to make a mold of. So I had already sculpted this. Usually, as I said, I work with objects that already exist in the world. But this time I decided I was going to make these little microbes, these little dinoflagellates, and from this series that I never did anything with. So the first thing I'm going to do, I would suggest if you're going to make a 2-part mold, focus on something that's symmetrical for your first 2-part mold. And you have to really think about undercuts. So this does have some undercuts, which I resolved as I worked through the process, because I wasn't thinking I was going to be making molds of this. But the first thing I'm going to do is pretty symmetrical. So I'm going to draw a line with a Sharpie and kind of decide where this breaks in half to become a 2-part mold. Next slide. And then I'm going to build clay around it. So on the left, I'm just starting to fill in clay. I'm paying attention to where that Sharpie line is, because I'm going to have a 2-part mold. I have to have 2 parts that really pay attention to where the middle line is. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to get these objects out of the mold. And then I have to decide all the way on the right, how I'm going to get clay to pour into this. So I gave it some thought, and I decided that, it's going to have 2 channels, because the channel that's coming off the cone, I was trying to figure out where I could do this. So the channel that's coming off the top is going to be pretty narrow. So I decided I needed a second channel to get the porcelain in there, the slip in there, and also get the slip out. So I thought about maybe doing it from the other end, but then the problem about gravity also. The porcelain has to pour into the mold and fill the mold completely. And if I had a channel at the other end, the porcelain has to come up to fill the two little spikes at the end. So that wouldn't work. And I thought about doing it from the side, but then I would lose that channel, and I didn't want to lose that channel. So you can go to the next slide. So then, yeah, that's good. So then you can see that I also impressed, not too deeply, but I impressed some tools actually into the clay so that I'm creating keys so that when I have two sides, they'll lock together perfectly and they won't slip, they won't be offset. Because then you've got two pieces that don't fit together, and that can happen if you don't have any keys. I use mold boards. Mold boards are basically just a board that you stick a 2x2 onto so that you can use clamps to hold it together. And then also shown here, you can see I have some Murphy soap. Murphy soap is like the best mold release and also is good for the maintaining the mold boards. These are really old mold boards. I've used them a lot. So they have a lot of plaster that I can't get off of them now, but they're still very functional and they have not warped tremendously. I made these myself, these mold boards. Again, I just got, wood and I attached a 2x4 to it. And I screwed the 2x4 on the edges and then they can all link together. Next slide. So this is looking into the mold, with the mold boards around. Notice on the left, I've started to fill in where the mold boards meet. If I don't do that, the plaster is going to run out through those little tiny crevices, those little areas where they don't quite meet. And also around the edges, everywhere that you see where the clay is not meeting the wood, I have to completely fill that in and smooth that out. Otherwise, the plaster is going to run right out of there. And you'll also notice I kind of put a texture into that channel because there were some undercuts in there. And I don't mind this. I mean, I wanted a texture anyway, so it works out really well for me. I probably would have sculpted it with the texture if this had been my original intention to make molds out of this. So then on the right, you can see it completely filled in with all the edges having wet clay in them and sealed, and all the edges sealed so the plaster can't escape. And then you can see how the clamps are attaching. You can use C-clamps. I really like these pressure clamps, these quick grip clamps, but you can use C-clamps, which are really cheap. And they just grab where that 2x2 is and then hold it to the wood really tight. You go to the next slide. So then I'm going to put a coat of the Murphy's oil soap on the little piece that I'm casting, just so that it doesn't stick. But I'm also going to do the same thing. The wet clay is going to come right off. That's not going to be a problem. But I'm also going to treat the mold boards with that so the plaster doesn't pull all the moisture out of the wood and then they start to warp and become non-functional. So Murphy's oil soap, it's the best. And then don't use plaster of Paris if you don't have to. Pottery plaster is so much better. It does a much better job of taking the water out of the slip. It's much more absorbent. I don't know if there's a place that you can get that in Stillwater, but I'm sure in Tulsa you can. And certainly in Oklahoma City you can. I'm positive you can get that. Because if I can get it in Lawrence, Kansas, you can get it there. But you really want to make sure that you get this. It comes in 50-pound bags, which, makes you stronger. And then the next slide. So then I'm going to mix my plaster. And plaster, the way you mix plaster is you're going to sift it in slowly into a bucket that has room temperature water. If it's too cold, it's going to be a softer mold. It's going to take a long time to set. If it's hot, it sets like this. And then it's a harder mold and not as absorbent. You kind of want to get a room temperature water. And then you can see I have a plastic bag on here. Unfortunately, I am not a fan of plastic, but plastic bags come into my life way too often. And but where the place that I buy my slip from, I'm not mixing my own slip because I just don't have the room to do that. And there's a place in Kansas City, which I live near, which does a really fabulous slip. So I buy the slip from them, but they bag it in these plastic bags and they double bag it. So there's one plastic bag that you really wouldn't be able to use because it's all covered with slip. But the outer plastic bag, I have all these plastic bags. So I use it to protect the bucket so that I can keep reusing this bucket. When you start getting a lot of plaster stuck in the bucket or on the bucket, then those little flakes get into the plaster and your mold isn't as strong or as functional as if it's all just fresh plaster. On the right, you notice that I kept sifting it in until it creates an island. That's really important. And then I leave that for about 5 to 10 minutes. And then we could go to the next slide. And then I mix it. And then as I'm mixing it, plaster is an interesting substance. There's the thixotropy again. But it goes through several stages. So first it's a liquid, then it starts to gel. And if you had water that was too warm, it'll gel really fast. But then if you shake it up, it becomes liquid again. It's still not ideal to use it that way, but you can. And then eventually it'll cure into a solid. Next slide. So then I pour it. So on the left, I'm pouring, and I've made a mark. I want to make sure, even in a small mold, I want to have a couple of inches beyond the tallest part of my object, because I want enough plaster to really be there to suck that water out of the slip. And then you see the center slide. There's a lot of little bubbles in there. There's also bubbles sitting on the surface of my object. And if I don't do anything, they're going to stick on the surface. And then I'll have all these issues with when I cast that I'll have to clean up all those little bubbles. So what I'm going to do is, usually I do a little bit of shaking of the mold, and I'll knock the side and shake it a little bit and knock the side, and you see the bubbles come up through the plaster. And it's not bad if they're on the surface, because you're not casting on that surface, but you really want to make sure that they're not clinging to your object that you're casting. Next. So then you let it sit, and so plaster has a chemical reaction with water. And so first it's going to just be very cool. It's going to start to set. It's going to start turning into a solid. And then it gets really, really hot. So you don't want to do anything when it's really, really hot, because it's also really soft at that stage. This is also the reason why you don't put plaster on somebody's face. You have to be really careful when you make molds of a face. You have to keep that very thin, because it gets to such a point where it can actually burn skin. But you can feel it when it cools down again. When it goes from cool to hot to cool again, then you can take the mold boards off. So next slide. So when you take the mold boards off, on the left is just having taken off the mold boards. Then I flipped it over and you can see the clay, and then that clay is just going to come right off. And then usually what I'll do is I'll clean off the edges, because you can see on the left how there's kind of like some sharp edges there. I don't want any of that I don't want to keep any of that, because as I use this, I don't want those to break off and get into my slip. I want to have nice smooth edges on my mold, and it's easier to do when it's still curing and it's still kind of soft. So then you do the whole thing all over again. So here's the mold. This is so you can see that the object's in the plaster, and you got to keep those channels filled. Otherwise, you just have another key. You want to make sure that you are keeping those channels filled with clay so that they're going to be open and not closed. So you do the whole thing over again. I usually do 2 coats of the Murphy soap on plaster. So it's a great mold release. It will totally separate just fine. And then on the right, you see the object removed. I need to clean up that mold, but I've got a mold now that I can use to cast. I usually let it cure for a couple of days before I try to use it. So this is just this little object that I've had sitting around that I decided I wanted to make a mold of, but I don't want to make a 2-part mold. I'm just going to make a 1-part mold out of this. So this is good for like if you want to make little texture molds that you use as a press mold. I'm thinking I'll use this as a press mold. Maybe cast it a little bit, but mostly a press mold. So anyway, so I just put this object in some clay. Mixing up some plaster, and you see I got my island, so I'm moving forward. But I'm going to do this a little different. I'm not going to use mold boards this time. Instead, I'm going to, first I'm going to splatter the liquid plaster in a really light layer on top of that object in the clay. So that's what you see on the right. And I want to do that to make sure it really soaks in and it really captures the texture. And then if you go to the next slide. So, and then I'm going to wait till it starts to gel. And I'm going to slather it over the top. And as it's setting, as it's really setting up, I start to clean up that mold on the back and smooth it out and give it a shape. And if you go to the next slide. So there I've removed the object, and I want to clean off any like sharp edges. The way, because I kind of expanded beyond, you know, the clay area, there's a little bit of an edge there, and I always want to smooth out any rough edges. So there's nothing that breaks off, that's sharp, that has an undercut in it, that's going to, you know, be a problem when I'm using this mold. And then there's a little press mold of the texture, just as a test. So I think that's it. Let's see. Oh yeah, happy casting. And oh, here's like a bigger piece. This is a bigger piece. This is so I've been working with funnels. So this is a funnel that I made a mold of, and I've been making some casts and manipulating. And just kind of quickly, here are some of my press molds. And again, these are just really quick because I don't want to spend a lot of time on them, and they work fine. They don't have to be super beautiful to be functional. This was like some kind of Christmas thing that had like sparkles in it, but I really liked the texture on it. And I've used this quite a bit. These were fish scales that I got at Call Lake. It was really smelly. I was so glad when I threw that away. So I had fish scales. This one I've used, let me see. I use this one a lot. This actually has little bits of hair in it. It's not real hair. This was like a Halloween wig. And I've used this a lot, and it kind of looks like water when I use it. So that was kind of, that was a good find. Sometimes I also make a 1-part mold of something that is going to be cast, and I'm going to pull out of the mold as a full rounded object, but the whole top, it's going to be 1 part, so the top is going to be completely open. And the way I would work that is, I would pour slip into the mold, and I'd pour it all the way up to the top. And then I wait till I look at the edge, and I'm looking for how thick an edge I want. And sometimes it starts to recede, so I might move it around a little bit to make sure it's going to be even. And then I pour it out, and then I'll use a little piece of clay. You just need to break the suction to pull something out. And slip loves slip, so slip really sticks to slip. So you can just use like a little ball of clay that's made out of slip, and just use that as a way of pulling things out. So sometimes I'll do that as well. Oh, I just want to note that when you're doing something that has holes in it, you have to close them up. And when I make the mold, I totally fill this in so there are no undercuts, because otherwise it'll get stuck in the mold. Then for slip casting or slip trailing, that's another thing that molds are really great for. So this is a piece that was slip trailed inside a mold and then taken out. So again, that's that process I was showing you with the bottles and making those lines. And you can do that in a mold and then take that out and fire it. Okay, I don't know, got any questions? I can pull something out if you want to see something else.
All right, that's great timing too. So we have about 15-20 minutes for Q&A. I know both Robin and Jessica are hosting live groups in their areas, and so if you guys want to tune in, if anyone wants to type in a question to the chat, then I can help moderate that. Does anyone want to start off with a question, or I will sort of ask mine first? All right, I'll give you guys a moment to think, collect your thoughts. I guess I just have one point is we've done a number of both virtual and live tours in the galleries, and when we ask people to sort of take a longer look at the transmutation series, especially students are kind of fascinated with why there are grenades in there. And we kind of say, why do you think there are grenades? And so I love how many conceptual layers your work has, with the fact that I also love the alliteration of Walmart and water. And so it's a sort of grenade for water balloons that was found at Walmart is also kind of baffling. But we did have students chime in and say that sometimes people can surrender firearms and explosives to the police department, and sometimes they'll go out on the lake to detonate old grenades and things like that. And so I wonder if there is actually, like, you know, maybe someone has actually thrown a grenade in a lake here in Oklahoma. I guess the other question that I had that also deals with so many conceptual layers in your work, which is just fabulous visually and also critically for us, you know, deep thinkers as well as art historians and fellow artists. I have had the opportunity to enjoy some great wabi-sabi workshops. I used to work with a photographer who would do a walking wabi-sabi photography workshop where they would just go very much like Guy Debord or the Situationalist International, like a Derivive, where they're just out on this trek looking to see things and not looking for anything in particular. And so I think it's great that you reference that, because it sounds like the way you're sort of traveling through Oklahoma and sort of this Derivive around lakes, this Derivive through Walmart sometimes, just kind of looking for things that are uncanny or beautiful, very much fits in with this. And it also made me think of sort of the Derivive, sort of this traveling nature of different species that are also highlighted in the state we're in, water, and especially invasive species, and sort of how I'm sort of connecting wabi-sabi, a transient nation of wabi-sabi, all the way to invasive species, particularly the ecological effects that are highlighted in your show. And so I'm not sure if that's much of a question, but just you've blown my mind with all of your conceptual ties. And is that something that you thought about when you were collecting items, or it just kind of organically happened because it aligns with some of your artistic mission?
To answer some of your questions, because that was a lot. In terms of the grenades, one thing that I think a lot about is ammunition manufacturing places are often near waterways, which is, and then you get these this pollution from them. And there's several places that are like that are still being cleaned up. Also, people often will fire guns, and I found so many cartridges. I actually have cartridges as well in the exhibition. I found so many cartridges along lakesides that are just left there and not cleaned up. So I think that there's a lot to do with explosives like grenades and ammunitions that get into the waterways that we don't think of. Then with the wabi-sabi, I think the wabi-sabi is a beautiful idea. And so I don't know, I'm trying to think through how we exist in the world, and I'm trying not to be like, so entropy is so depressing that I don't really want to stay there. I kind of like more the idea that we need to recognize that things are repurposed in the material world, that all things are transient, that they're becoming something else all the time. Things decay and they become another, they transform, they transmute. So I'm trying to rethink some of that as well. But I also think that there is something interesting in entropy. And so I combine all those things together in the way that I'm thinking about it. And I do think of my work as Baroque in a very kind of, in a very aesthetic kind of approach to decay and entropy and wabi-sabi, because I feel like there's a lot of drama in the work, and it has a sensuousness that maybe you wouldn't expect to associate with a waste stream. So, so I think that's where all that stuff comes from. But yeah, I do think wabi-sabi is, a recognition of how things are changing all the time and imperfect. There's nothing perfect in our world.
I can totally relate to all that. Someone who's fascinated with entropy as well. It's not all doom and gloom, although some of it is. We have a great question here from Callie. Thanks for joining us today, Callie. We miss you. Do you fire your bisque pieces inside of or a part of green pieces? If I'm combining things, I'll just bring this piece over. So this piece is mostly green. So this is like part of this is a part that you attach to a funnel. So I'm interested in these automotive funnels right now. So this is a part that attaches to an automotive funnel so that it can like be manipulated to go where it needs to go. But this is a piece that's already been fired. And so I just attach them together and I'll put this in and bisque it again. So then I'll take it to maturity. So I really enjoy adding in these shards and little pieces as things that I break apart. There's some more of it over here. And I'll put it into the unfired clay. And then I'll bisque the whole thing so that it's more on par. It's not going to shrink as much when it goes into the high fire. I fire pretty high though for a bisque. I fire at 04, which a lot of people would say, why are you firing at 04? But because I have so much very delicate construction, that if I don't do that, then the bisque is too soft to work with when I take it out. So I'm taking it pretty high already when I bisque it. There's a lot of clays that that reach maturity at 04. And then the porcelain I'm using actually is kind of a mid-range porcelain. It fires at a cone 6. Other questions? Let's see.
For a 3-part mold, I see that one. You have to think about how you're going to block off the area that's going to be a 3-part mold. So you just block it off where that's going to be. Let me see, I've got one here. So this is a large scrub brush that I haven't cast yet, but I will be casting soon. And so I decided that I could deal with the fact that I'm casting it down the middle of the back of the scrub brush. And then because I really wanted to get the back of the scrub brush as well, and it has a really interesting texture in it. So you just kind of decide, you do the same thing. You figure out how you're going to break it up. You can break it up with, I usually will break it up with some kind of material that is going to hold up to the plaster. Sometimes, you know, you could use sheet metal. I don't use sheet metal. I usually use something like foam core or something to create the part that's going to be broken up. But yeah, it's you kind of identify the areas and how you break it up. You can have a 4, 5, 6 part mold, depending on undercuts. I mean, that's really what it is. That's why I always suggest that if you have not made a mold before, you start with something that's very symmetrical just to get the feel for it. But you have to, some objects are just going to have a lot of undercuts. And you have to, and if you're going to cast that thing and you can't break the object apart to cast the parts differently, then you have to identify certain areas and isolate them and cast that, and then go to the next part and cast that. And you have to create ways that they're going to connect with the keys in each part. And then you just like take the whole thing, however many pieces it is. And I use these straps that you get at the local Home Depot. And you will use straps to hold the mold together so that when you pour the plaster, it's all held together.
Great. I had a couple more questions in the comments here. One from Kristen is, and maybe you touched on this a little bit, is the slip trailing how you created the fabulous netting detail in some of your transmutation pieces, or are those actual netting that you've casted off, or a combination? You showed us how you sort of add things together in the bisque process.
It's a combination. Some of it is completely slip trailed. Like this is just slip trailing. And some of it is netting that's been cast and then press molded. Some of it is netting. For ceramic burnout, you can, if it's an absorbent substance, works really well, that you can put it into slip, and the slip gets into all the little crevices. So some of the netting, it is more like lace-based, and there's lots of little pockets for the slip to get into and hold. But I always also slip trail on top of that for strength.
That's great. It's such an intricate process. One last, also very dynamic question here before I know some people have to log off. Chris would like to know more about your coloration and your processes involved with the wall piece, the Glasshouse's diatome wall in the show, and especially since they're smaller pieces that are sort of suspended, but really have this armature of a wire on the back of it. And what I can do here as well is I can share screen a picture of this just in case anyone isn't familiar with this work.
Mm-hmm. Well, those are not ceramic. So that's fine. Those are not ceramic.
Are you using a mold for these, or is it,
no,
are they all just individually sculpted?
Like I said, I mean, I'm basically an installation artist who uses different materials at different times depending on what I'm making. So those are actually a 2-part epoxy clay. So the whole process for those would be just, I mean, it's really, it's really easy. I mean, anyway, it's just basically taking a fine metal mesh and attaching, so this is basically the same thing. So these objects are, they are just a fine metal mesh inside, and then I sculpted a little bit with liquid paper and let that dry on there just to give it some volume. And then I put a skin of 2-part epoxy clay. And then these are painted, and they also have decals on them. I don't know if you can actually see.
Oh yeah.
So that's the same way I made the diatoms.
Great.
And that's basically what those other forms that I showed you were originally going to be. But then I decided to do something else with them. Here's what the epoxy clay looks like. Again, when it's got nothing on it, it's not painted, it doesn't have any decals. But what I wanted to do with these is I got the idea that I want to create like a curtain of these dinoflagellates. And I realized that they can't be solid. This is way too heavy. So these have a lot of imperfections. Like I have like an area where I was going to like attach, I actually even had in there a wire for hanging it. But when I realized I was going to cast them, I cut them all off. So these are all kind of wonky now. But when I work them through in clay, I'll be able to clean it up.
Great. Does anyone want to slip in one more question for Marguerite, or see any of her molds flashed before us before we say goodnight? All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing a little bit of a perspective into your mold making process and your work in different types of clay and porcelain. And it's been really fascinating to get a sort of VIP experience into your basement studio here. And so I know even those of us in the museum who get to sort of work right in the gallery installations are continuously finding interesting things. And like I said, so many conceptual dimensions, as well as the technical processes you guys are using are both traditional and experimental and sort of very interesting. We have a lot of thank yous coming in the chats from all of our professors, and of course here at the museum. We also want to extend that thanks to you, of course, the engagement with the community, but in particular with the university as our primary directive. And so you guys riling up all your students and getting them a great bevy of them to tune into this talk today just warms our hearts, and we love it as much as you guys do. So thank you guys all for attending. Like I said, if any of your students couldn't make it today, we will release the recording of this to professors as well as have it on our YouTube page. And you can learn much more about the state we're in water through the multitude of videos and interactives we have on our website and our YouTube page, or also our other social media channels. Like I said, Marguerite's next talk will be in conjunction with Robin Lasser and will be held on March 9th. After that, we are going to hear about exhibition design from Paulo Sanza and Bruce Scherting. And then we have some special guests who are talking about interdisciplinary water studies, particularly one of our guest speakers is an expert in hydrant engineering, and the other one in aquaculture and ponds and streams particular to Oklahoma. So we hope that you'll tune in for the whole series or catch them recorded on YouTube. So thank you again, Marguerite, and everyone involved. You know how to get a hold of us, hopefully. If you don't, you'll find all of our contact at museum.okstate.edu. Thank you guys. Have a good night.
Good night, everybody.